welcome to the Expert Talks Online today. This is our third session of Lightning Talks in our series celebrating International Women's Day, featuring some of the brilliant women in the EE network of experts. And I'd like to give a warm welcome to our speakers today, Erica, Liz, Gino and Mia. Thank you so much for taking some time to join us and doing the preparation that goes into these events. Even lightning talks take far more preparation than anybody really expects, I believe. We've got three talks, and our first talk today is called Designing a Service of Pret a Manger as the World Changed in 2020. And the two women who are going to talk to us today are Erica. Erica is a user researcher, worked with Pret at the moment. She's been with EE in the EE's network for 3 years and has spent quite a few years working on government projects across the Home Office. And Liz is a user experience designer and has been with EE about the same time, worked with the Very Group and Pret also recently. But before she came to EE, she was with the BBC and led the UX teams for CBeebies and CBBC, which we all know and love. And I'll pass over to Erica and Liz. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi. I will share the screen. Okay. So we are going to talk to you a bit about Pret a Manger and the work we've been doing. So as many of you know, Pret is a really successful coffee and sandwich company with lots of shops, very concentrated in London, but about 380 shops in the UK, plus shops in Hong Kong, France and the US. And Pret were at the beginning of their digital journey as COVID hit last year. And they were already thinking about building a transactional capability, but obviously with the onset of a pandemic, they needed to think about moving quite quickly and moving at pace. And as well as that, they hadn't quite figured out what propositions would actually be valuable to the customers and valuable to the business. So Erica and I embarked on this kind of piece of work to look at what would be valuable from a customer point of view, but also for Pret. And that meant thinking about, the experience in shops, because Pret is very much a bricks and mortar company. They've been doing the same thing really well for 34 years. So moving into digital was obviously quite a big leap. So we were very much looking at the operational side as well as the customer experience. And Erica and I were fortunate enough to work on this last April, May through into June. I'm going to hand over to Erica to talk a bit about what we were doing.
Hello, everybody. So it's nothing new to do remote user research to design a digital service. So interviews, usability tests as part of the later work we did on the programme. But as a click and collect service for Pret would have an in-store process. And we think as user experience practitioners, we want to solve whole problems for users. We needed to think about designing a complete and great customer experience from contemplating buying your sandwich right through to picking it up in the shop. And so to do that, we needed to make sure we understood customer needs and in-store processes to design this great service. So usually if I was doing a discovery, I'd be in the shop, observing customers, trying to immerse myself in that experience, watching customers interact with the staff, choosing their food. I'd have intercepted them for interviews. And I'd have wanted to learn about shop processes firsthand, because although I've been a Pret customer many times, I've never been backstage at Pret before. I don't know what systems they're using. And so we had to completely rethink the approach we would have taken to immerse ourselves in the experience as we started this right at the beginning of the first lockdown. So we asked the staff to send us videos of in-store processes to help us understand the shop setup. So a handful of shops stayed open near hospitals to serve hospital workers. So there were a few shops who could help us with this. And we weren't geographically located anywhere near enough to go and look at them ourselves. This was so helpful for us to understand the context. And also to understand customer experience. I did a lot of video interviews with customers, but also asked them to send me photographs and just try to understand their contextual experience. The other thing we wanted to do to kind of get a sense of how customers might feel shopping in a Pret once the restrictions were lifted was think about some kind of proxy measures we could use to understand their behaviour. So it's best practice to think about what people, how people might actually behave right now then asked them to kind of predict how they might behave in the future. And we knew that people were doing essential grocery shopping. So we asked them, how did they feel about being in shops? How did they feel about touching food items, perhaps that other people had touched, interacting with staff? And also, had they started thinking about using delivery or click and collect services that maybe they'd not used before, just to give us a sense of how customer behaviour was changing in the space. The other thing we did was speak to customers in Hong Kong, because coffee shops were still open there under COVID, we were able to get a bit of a sense of what the UK might be like in a few months' time when restrictions were lifted, when we were ready to launch the service, and what we could learn from those coffee shops operating under COVID restrictions. Next slide, please. So through this discovery piece, we kind of identified different user profiles where some people were just super keen to get back to normal, get into Pret, choose their own items, were much more relaxed about COVID. And for those people, if Pret wanted to convert those takeaway customers, we knew we needed to make the service more exclusive, faster, more convenient than heading in as normal for takeaway. But for those who are more cautious, click and collect might offer an opportunity for them to socially distance whilst getting their food. And we had other profiles of people who were shielding at home or who were just very cautious and wanted to wait. And for those people, a delivery service might be more appropriate. And through our staff research, we learned that introducing a new service is going to need to be really carefully managed, because there's suddenly an increase in Deliveroo drivers in the shop. So they're creating these COVID kind of social distancing hotspots that hadn't been there before. We've got increased queues because there were fewer staff because of socially distanced working. And we needed to make sure that if we were going to implement a new click and collect pickup point in the shop, we wouldn't degrade the customer experience for takeaway customers or get in the way of the Deliveroo drivers who needed to fulfill those orders. Next one, please. So towards the end of our discovery, Pret trialled out turning on the pickup option on a well-known delivery platform that they were already using for deliveries, just to see if customers would engage. And this was a great test bed for us. So I used kind of an adapted diary study method, which is where you can contextually get people's lived experience when you're not actually there to view it yourself. So I asked people, I gave them £15 to buy lunch through this service, take photographs along their journey. These are real photographs that some of those people took, so that I could understand contextually what it was like to complete a click and collect order. And we had learned already from our discovery interviews that customers had this really high expectation of the consistency, good service, speed, quality at Pret. And we learned from this trial that there were areas that we would need to really focus on in order to make our new digital and in-shop service a success to meet those customer needs. So we found from this, the notifications in the platform didn't support customers to feel informed, and the in-shop experience didn't support customers to find their order. So we knew that wayfinding was really important, and that there would need to be some really good content design in our notifications and in the user journey, so people knew what to do. And there's some things that were highlighted that are such small things to fix, but we found we were using too much packaging for single drinks. And customers don't like that. Everybody wants to be sustainable. They don't want too much packaging. And we also found that, our bags had no handles, which is great for delivery drivers, but not so much if you're a click and collect customer who's also carrying a laptop and is off to have a working lunch in the park or something whilst carrying their order. And on the staff side, we found that it was confusing for staff who couldn't easily differentiate in the system whether this was a delivery or a pickup order. So we knew there were things we needed to do on that side from a service design perspective. So this little mini trial helped us to consider what we would need to be testing. And we took that forward into some more considered trials for the in-shop experience, while we then worked on optimizing the digital experience alongside. So I'll just pass back to Liz now.
Yeah, so as we sort of embarked on those trials, we wanted to also just stop and look at what they were doing around delivery. So working with Just Eat, Deliveroo and Uber Eats, well known to all of us by now. But this was, a year ago when it was still early days. And we just wanted to look at, how are the teams coping with this new way of working with fulfillment? So there were, looking at managing 3 tablets and a printer on a table, and then how do they manage the drinks coming through? So looking at the receipt, coffee calling to the baristas, thinking about bagging. They needed basically a separate fulfillment area, which was actually front of house. Whereas, as from being in Pret. They're very sort of elegant and nicely designed. And instead we had these quite makeshift setups with tables and racks and napkins, and the staff kind of had to adapt to create basically a sort of impromptu fulfillment area front of house. But from that, we were able to start looking at some of the pain points, what was challenging for them. And we effectively use that as an indicator, as if this is how it works for delivery, there's a good chance that they're also going to find that challenging when it comes to order ahead, click and collect, the kind of, even though the customer's coming to pick it up rather than delivery driver, the fulfillment piece is quite similar. And so from there, we were able to identify what we thought would be some tests to do within the shops. And we ran the trials in 5 shops, and we wanted to basically find out, will customers use the service? How do we get the best operational setup so it's easy for staff to operate? But also, is it going to, generate sales and revenue for Pret? Part of moving to a digital operation is to think about new ways, new channels for customers to use. So within those 5 shops, we had a number of different things we wanted to run, hypotheses to test. So everything from, how we did the bagging, did we put hot and cold food together or separately? How much packaging was used? When to prepare drinks, like should we prepare them just a couple of minutes before customers arrive or wait till they arrive? Lots of concern around, the quality and the temperature of drinks, because coffee is really key. and we also wanted to look at, the positioning of those click and collect stations in terms of how would customers find anything. They're very much used to coming straight up to the till. So these are some of our early sketches where we took the 5 shops and thought about, what's the flow of the customer? Where do they go? Currently, they'll go straight to the till by default. How do we manage them going to somewhere else? How do we signpost to them that, A, there is this service available, but also this is where to go within the shop to find it? And then also thinking about where the team member would go and how we would set up something that would work for them. So this one actually at Aldgate shows a hatch collection station, which was effectively using their second door as a hatch with a table in the doorway. So very much sort of prototyping out different ideas. And then we only had sort of 2 weeks really to actually get the trials live from the, finishing our discovery. And so you can see it all came to life quite quickly. We had the marketing, we had big vinyls on the windows, the collection areas, and staff to sort of greet in some cases. In other cases, we had a sort of self-serve trial as well. But we tried out a whole load of different variables basically over the space of a month to see what would work and what didn't. Really working closely with the teams. So as you can imagine, to run trials like this, you need to work with the operations team, the property team, marketing, effectively all of the functions across the business. And whilst they're great at working in that way normally within the shop, obviously layering in digital was a new part of this. And we're all working remote as well. So we started using Mural and Miro as our sort of collaboration tools, which is probably the first time we've been using those with Pret. And this is just a snapshot of like one of the boards where we had, everything from the tasks we need to do, the team, the shop layouts, the things we're trying to test. So it's almost like a virtual whiteboard that you probably have had if we would have been in the office. But that just helped with the ways of working and having daily stand-ups around a real life physical trial, but we still use some of our digital ways of working to try and bring everybody together and collaborate. So we learned a lot through the trials, and Erica's just going to talk through some of the highlights of what we learned from that.
Yeah, so we were evaluating from a customer perspective and also from a staff perspective, because we were taking the view that the staff are users of this service too as they were operating it. So we learned about the signposting. We'd already seen that was very important, and that any confusion there degrades the customer experience considerably. People are so used to how they experience Pret that this could be quite negative. And we just found little things like we expected customers would be wanting order for lunchtime in advance, but people were ordering as soon as possible for a kind of ASAP functionality. So that helped us think about what we needed to put into our digital proposition. We had a question about whether customers would mind their drink being pre-prepared on arrival or whether they would want it made as they arrived. And we found that as long as it was hot, customers were happy for it to be made pre-prepared and they could just grab it and go. And they really didn't like too much packaging. And that was just something we'd picked up and fed back to the operational team. And I guess overall, we knew that customer take-up might be low during this period. and that click and collect, it might not be solving a problem for users during the pandemic, apart from those who want to socially distance and still get a Pret experience. But we know that the key problem to solve will be saving time for customers. So as footfall increases, we think that we'll be able to experiment with this again. And alongside this, we were usability testing our digital journey. And then so by the June, we were able to have our first customer, buying a sandwich through our digital experience that we designed and tested, and collecting it in shop using the in-store experience that we'd honed through these trials. That's it. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you both. Could you just stop sharing for a second?
Sure.
That was really interesting. Thank you. I was really struck by the whiteboard and the use of the space of the whiteboards, and you could see kind of the different areas that you could work in, for like where the delivery drivers go and all the back office work going on. Really interesting. Thank you. We've got a couple of questions, and I'm going to start. The first one I'm going to start with is, how did the research and service design inform the software side of what you built for Pret? This is a great question, actually, because I was really struck by the fact that we didn't talk about software at all in your talk.
That was our intention. We thought it was interesting, but we, alongside all of this, all of the research we were doing was feeding into the digital journey. So as the initial discovery involved no solutionizing or build, we just gathered our user needs and we tried to understand what the service would need to do to meet those needs. And then we fed that into a prototype for a digital proposition. And we just tested and iterated that digital proposition with customers, all over video calls, because we couldn't meet people face to face. So yeah, we really kept that feedback loop going all throughout this process.
And I think we did know that Pret wanted to build a transactional capability, even though they weren't quite sure what proposition they wanted to attach to that, whether it was click and collect or delivery. So there were quite a few sort of foundational pieces we could do around, browsing a menu, being able to take payment, being able to send confirmation. There were all those things that we could start designing and building, even though we weren't quite sure exactly what the actual end use would be. So we were doing quite a bit in parallel, which probably isn't our preferred way of working, but based on the fact we were in the middle of a pandemic and Pret were losing, significant money each week, it was kind of like, how do we help them to move quickly on this, and try and get something live within a few months rather than several months or a few quarters. It was like we really wanted to try and go fast to help them.
Talking of which, talk about the pandemic rather, one of the questions here is, how did you carry out the research and stay safe at the same time while you're in a pandemic?
Obviously keeping our distance is very important. So we didn't do any face-to-face research at all. Later on, we were able to do some observational stuff as part of the trials once the restrictions were slightly lifted. One of the things I was really concerned about was asking customers to go in as part of these mystery shopping trials. So I didn't open that up to the general public. I just used our network to do that, because I didn't want that voucher that I was offering people to go in and buy their lunch to be an incentive for anybody to put themselves at risk to go into a shop. So there's ethics on a customer side, as well as keeping ourselves safe. I think one of the things we missed out on, you don't get that full richness of data when you're doing things remotely, but I don't think we lost out on the level of insight that we gathered by doing it remotely.
Yeah, and the general managers were really helpful at, being really accommodating when we'd ask them to send a video. Within, a couple of hours, they're on WhatsApp kind of sending us something. So they were really helpful, I have to say. We couldn't have done it without the Pret teams on the ground.
Brilliant. And then one last question from Paul is, what were the key metrics and what was the impact on the customer lifetime value? Were you able to judge any of that?
Do you mean the trial metrics, Paul? I suppose he can't answer.
Yeah, let's assume he does. Yeah. In the context of the trial that you were doing, what were the key metrics you were looking at?
Well, we were looking at speed, and we were looking at satisfaction, and ease of use. So there were a lot of this we had to measure qualitatively. Originally, we were thinking quantitatively, we'll have big numbers and we'll be able to evaluate how fast people can pick up their order and compared to a takeaway order. but it was a lot of qualitative satisfaction and ease of use measures. And over time, once we have higher volume, we're going to trial and test. We'll be testing again to kind of stress test some of this with more quantitative metrics.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you very much, both of you. Thanks, Erica. Thanks, Liz. We're going to go on to our next lightning talk, which is called Beyond Cunningham's Tech Debt Analogy. And I'd like to welcome Gio Fassa, who is Head of Engineering Ops at the OLX Group in Lisbon. She's one of our management associates that's worked out of the Lisbon office for a while for Equal Experts, having been very active in London for about 15 years, and she moved to Portugal and leads the operational excellence for OLX. Gio, pass over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sam. And yeah, great talk, Liz and Erica. It was really, really cool. I decided to spend a little bit of time putting together this lightning talk for the very main reason that tech debt is just a concept we often are exposed to. It's a term that has been around since the early 90s. We'll talk a little bit later about where this comes from, but it's really quite funny that considering debt is debt, we often don't talk back about that debt. So for instance, we often talk about the term in passing, or we use the term when we really have to convince someone that we really, really want to do something, but then we never seem to talk back and say, okay, we paid it back, or it was this bad, or it was worse than what we thought, or not as bad as it was. So we seem to also have been introducing new processes to talk about tech debt or to handle tech debt. In the industry and engineering, we talk about golden time, then we have the 20% time. Some companies, for instance, like Spotify in the past, have used chapters as a means of handling their debt. But there still remains this eternal discussion as to whether this debt is really debt and how big of a debt it is. So this was the reason why I chose this topic. I wondered what happened to the analogy. Ward Cunningham started us well off talking about debt, and then it just stopped. So here we go. This is Ward, and this is how Ward, or debt as Ward sees it. So he talks about shipping first-time code is like going into debt. A little debt speeds development so long as it's paid back promptly with a rewrite. Every minute spent on not quite right code counts as interest on that debt. So there's an interesting focus here that Ward gives us on actually the idea of balancing speed of delivery with quality. But it's clear that what he's talking about here is short-term debt. So in financial terms, we would call that a liability as opposed to a long-term debt, because he does mention a rewrite. He talks about promptly with a rewrite. So clearly, Ward is referring to a liability. Martin Fowler then continues and builds further onto this idea, and he also comes up with further taxonomy analysis of how to handle debt or how to talk about debt. He differentiates what is deliberate debt, what is accidental debt, and he gives us yet another way of being able to talk about this debt. But still, myself, I'm left working in engineering without more analogies or a better way of talking about handling and what that debt or handling that debt leads us to. So let's see how Warren sees it. So Warren Buffett, I think he's no stranger to any of us here. He is a pretty loaded character that we all know about from the financial industry. And actually, there's a point when he's asked. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you for a sec. Your screen has disappeared. Perfect. Thank you.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's no problem. Don't worry. Just don't want to miss that important bit on the edge. Thank you.
Sure. Sorry. So Warren, he's asked by a friend about where she should be making her next investment. And famously, Warren's answer is, well, hang on. Apparently, you have a bunch of credit cards that are incurring an interest of 18%. To be honest, there's no better investment than actually paying back that credit card. So this is Warren Buffett. And clearly bearing in mind that as per other disciplines across social sciences, even economics has its own flair. So Warren Buffett might be one of those kind of guys that maybe he likes, to invest in a fewer things, but invest fully. Whilst you might have other type of investors that like to diversify even more without actually pinpointing the importance of owning things to the full. But certainly in this case, what Warren is saying is, look, there's no point in having or keeping a debt alive at 18% interest. So what is the key message here? Considering what Ward has said originally in 1992, with what Warren continues to say about, the 18%, that the interest of that debt is just, you're never going to be able to have a better investment than paying that off. Then I basically put together these two concepts. And actually what we're talking about here is that debt risk is all about the cost of loan, the cost of incurring that debt, coupled with the length of time you want to keep that debt running. So here I forgot to call on Uncle Bob, because I couldn't possibly claim to be working in this industry without quoting Uncle Bob a few dozen times a year. And in all his glory, this is him, leaving no room for misunderstanding. And he says, look, mess is not technical debt. Debt is intentional and it's thought through, and mess is always coming to the cost of companies and teams as a whole. So ultimately, what I'm hearing is that when you're choosing your debt, we're making informed decisions based on our understanding of the cost of that debt and the length of the time that we want our payments, so to speak, to carry on being sent out. So let's stop a moment and think, when was the last time that someone in your team actually invested that time in working out the cost of that debt they're about to incur and planned the length of time that they want to pay that debt back? I would say that often, more often than we'd like, there's these two bits of due diligence are left or sidelined, at least, to the very least. So here we go. This is where I end up. And I wonder, okay, so we did all this talk about debt. We used Warren, we used Ward, we even picked on Uncle Bob. That is always a good thing to do. But I'm left waiting for more from the financial industry, more analogies. And I wonder, what about credit? I have spent over the past few months reading a little bit about credit. How does credit work? And actually try to really extend that analogy that Ward has put through in the early 90s to try and understand whether we can actually use credit more as an analogy as opposed to debt as a way to talk about building healthy tech companies and therefore healthy tech organizations. So let's start with talking about the financial interpretation of credit. And the key question here is, how do people like me and you get access to credit? Especially if we're thinking about that kind of long-term credit or long-term access to funds, rather than the payday loan kind of thing that we all know doesn't look great on our credit score and also doesn't really do much of help for people that are trying to invest in a business. And the financial industry really relies on the concept of credit scores. So the credit scores almost represent an indicator that unites an ubiquitous language for risk. Different companies or that we're trying to access, or different types of loans that we're trying to ask for, will refer to a credit score as their way of understanding whether you are actually would be a good partner to lend money to. So why not do exactly this for the tech world? Why don't we think about this as a way of communicating with partners? So why don't we think about payment history as a way of saying our historical past? How many times in the history have I committed to doing something that actually I did do? And that would count. In this case, for FICO, that's a common indicator for credit scoring, it counts 35% of that decision counts on the fact that I've actually paid or fulfilled my duties in the past. Credit utilization also counts a lot within the FICO credit score. And with credit utilization, I could think that in the tech world, this would mean, do I have a plan of how I want to be using this loan or this time or this investment? Having a plan would definitely help. Then you have the credit age. This also counts. And for us working in engineering, this could be a clear idea of how long we want to ask our lender to invest in us. So how long do we want this loan for? The credit mix, are we diversifying? Are we thinking about risks? Are we thinking that maybe one way of abstracting or rewriting or refactoring a piece of legacy could actually go badly, and therefore we already have a second view of how we could do this? Have we had enough discussions around the different ways we could solve a problem? And then last but not least, the new credit. So the new credit line is quite interesting because it almost highlights how tricky the financial market is. And in the same way, how tricky the engineering world is. A lender wants to know that you will come back and keep asking, but not too much, 10% much, so to speak. So they want to know that you're so mature and you know what you're doing and you know who to speak to, and you're really creating a partnership with the other parties involved. So for instance, you could have a partnership with design, with product, with, for instance, marketing or sales. They want to know that you have all these relationships in place and that you're so grounded in these relationships that you're that cool to come back to me and ask me for more credit. And this is exactly what we need to value in engineering. And often we don't. We think of tech debt as a problem that is a tech problem. We don't think of tech debt as an opportunity for creating credit, or at least capital. So wrapping up here on the credit, fundamentally, spending properly is actually much better than not spending at all. So using or relying again on one of our Warren Buffett's BFFs, Charles Munger, he says, if you take the most powerful freshman text in economics and take a look at it today, it still makes sense. Intelligent people make their decisions based on opportunity cost. So they know what they're trying to achieve with the loan that they're going to go and ask. And this is where we get to growing tech capital. So how do we move the engineering department or the engineering parties involved from a mentality of being a lendee to becoming a lender, where they're actually owning capital? And these are the three things that I would suggest doing first, which is one, identifying your short-term debt, so the liabilities that Ward Cunningham used to talk about, and pay back that now, because nobody wants to buy a company that has really, really high liabilities. Second is identify the areas that you need credit for and express this in terms of opportunity cost. Using opportunity costs is basically the best way to have your partners and other partners outside and within the company understand what it is that you're really trying to unlock with that investment. And third, but not least, stop talking about debt and start talking about capital. The more we talk about debt in engineering, the more we're basically saying we're going to be, we're going to be drowning into debt, and this is the only thing we can ever aspire to. And finally, managing your portfolio as Warren would. So pay your liabilities on time, because that's definitely a good signal you're sending to the markets or to your partners. Plan investment in key areas, as said earlier, is equally to the credit score. If you have a plan of what you want to do with that investment, the market is basically open. The world is your oyster. The market is open for you. Building a diverse asset portfolio means that you need to know that you could do things in different ways, and you know what string to pull or what button to push to activate that diversity. And finally, track the portfolio the same way as you would with your financial assets, and adapt to the market, because things do change. So whilst you thought something was going to go one way, you need to be able to adapt to maybe move or diverge, disinvest to invest somewhere else. And this is it for me.
That's amazing. Thank you, Gio. Would you stop sharing your screen again for me, just so we can see everyone? Sure. Thank you for that. We've got a question. I've got a question too, but I'm going to ask the question that's come from the audience first. So this came in from just before the talk, which was, what are the first few actionable tasks that can be done to start building tech credit today? What can people start doing now?
Sure, yes. So as I said earlier in the presentation, I would really focus on identifying which part of your debt is a liability. So which part of your debt has to be paid now, and be very, very honest about this. The second step would be identifying or isolating the rest of the debt that is less of a liability, but is more like a long-term debt that at some point you thought or someone thought was a good idea to incur, and identify a plan or identify which part of this is long-term and work out whether there's a plan to handling that. And then start basically asking for investment and money to the rest of the business, without talking about money to pay off my debt, but it's more about investment to build tech capital.
Brilliant, thank you. And I was really struck by your analogies around finance, especially the credit scoring. I was just thinking that I personally would sort of immediately start trying to game the system and work out how to trick it. So I was just going to ask you that sort of in your leadership role as as the head of operational excellence, what do you look for in teams? How do you sniff out those that are trying to game it and aren't sort of really building the capital?
Yes, so within tech excellence, which is basically our part of operational excellence, what we try and do is we leverage lots of research. So we use, for instance, the DORA, the highly performing teams key metrics, as an indicator of how performing teams are, and then we use other key metrics like time to commit, or maybe diversity of RFCs, or how many ADRs are being written. There's a plethora of metrics that we have out there. But sure, in engineering, engineers love to game metrics, and not just them. So I think we've come to terms with the fact that everyone will always try and game it. But if we create an incentive large enough and interesting enough for the gaming to almost be to almost be a distraction than anything else, then we have seen people react really well to it. So the more we only talk about metrics and only quant, the more we're actually incentivizing a gaming mentality. If we talk about quant and also talk about the things that we can't put a number to, but we can certainly put a value to it. So we, for instance, even this morning I talked about the importance of having well-written ADRs that are in clear English, not in technical details. And people were saying, but why does this matter? Why are you constantly pushing back my ADR and asking me to rewrite this in plain English? It's just the value that we're trying to go through, which is the value we're trying to live, which is around the value of being understandable and being just having an ubiquitous language. So some things we can't have a metric to, and I think we're happy with that. It's okay, but we need to couple this with the metrics. So if we make this about values, then less people will try and game the system.
Brilliant, thank you, Gio. Lots of nodding there too from other panelists. So thank you. We'll just move on now to our final lightning talk of this lunchtime, which is called When Content Goes Wrong and Why, thankfully. And I'd like to welcome Mia O'Donoghue, a senior content designer at Equal Experts, who's done everything from online applications for UK passports to API documentation. And Mia's passionate about delivering the simple, accessible content for users. And she's helping EEE at the moment at HMRC create clear and usable content for staff investigating fraud, including claims of COVID schemes. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Sam. There we go. This is wonderful, Gio. Thank you for that. You were talking about plain English, so here is my realm. So I'm going to talk to you today about when content goes wrong and why. It will just be a brief overview. There's much more to this, but as I say, this is a lightning talk just to show you some funny examples, but also the serious side of content when it's not good enough for users. It's not like me to start on a negative, but I do want to say that content design is not copy editing. And the reason I want to say this is because you can have sublime grammar and perfectly correct spelling, and it can still be wrong. So for example, this was on a website for a large oil and gas event. So although it's grammatically correct, it will make people laugh. It's not hurting anybody, but it may not be good for that particular brand. This was on a letter about a healthcare tribunal. And I think they wanted an impartial person there, not a completely disinterested person. When I joined Universal Credit in the UK, if you are caring for somebody, you can apply for a carer's allowance, but you have to tell the government if you stop providing that person with care. And I thought this was great. I almost didn't want to change this. And it's not just digital, of course. This came through the door last week. I cannot figure out why a whole page of this leaflet has a keyboard on it. I think it's just trying to tell me I can order kind cereal bars online. And then, of course, we've got the bad old error messages. Thankfully, there are far fewer grey pop-ups with nonsense content on than there used to be, but terrible error messaging still abounds, and it's really painful for users. From the top example where you get the error message before you've even started filling out the data, we've all had those. The middle example where I just don't have any clue, you're not giving me any decent information about what's happened or what I can do about it. And my personal favourite, where the user can actually be in denial there ever was an error message. Everything's fine, I'll just be in a constant loop. So that's the funnies, but unfortunately, bad content is pretty serious. There are studies that show bad content, impenetrable content, complex language causes stress to all of us, and that's not just people who have dyslexia, or it's not their native language, or they have dyspraxia. Heart rate can increase when you are faced with something you don't easily understand. And of course, bad content stops users from doing something, be that buying something, registering for a coffee subscription, a Pret, although Pret's content is absolutely amazing. I happen to know the content designer there, another EE content designer. The other thing is that bad content with forms, particularly if a form has incorrect flow, incorrect labels, mislabeled buttons, you can really make unwittingly the user will give you incorrect data. And that's hard for any service and any set of staff or back-end caseworkers. And the last thing really is bad content really isn't good for your brand. Why content goes wrong? Really, there's quite a few things here, but the main reasons I've seen over the years of doing this is that with no ill intent, delivery teams they throw everything at the user that they think the user might need. From a brochure to a text to an online service or product, every single word needs a reason to be there, a reason for the user as well. So content designers, we don't just write, I think we spend about 60% of our time stopping words reaching a product or a service. And the best way we can do that, of course, is working with user researchers, testing with less, so test with less content so that you actually get the validation that additional messaging is needed. That's quite a brave approach that takes time and expertise in your research team. Yeah, I think the other thing is that without looking through a user-centered lens, experts will always use, they'll naturally use jargon and complex language because it's their own language. They don't realize that it is complex to somebody else. And I think that the role of a content designer really, again, is less about writing and more about translation. We spend more of our time listening to the business needs or government needs, listening to the user needs, watching users interact with content. And it's only once we've listened to all that and seen that we can work in the intersection and say, right, we will create some concise, clear content that's everything the business needs to say, but is still inherently useful and correct for users. Also, of course, unlike code, everybody can write, absolutely everybody, and everybody gets very excited about getting involved with content, but designing by committee is a really long, painful process, and it always ends up in long, painful sentences and content. It's just too much. And I think, again, here, the key is you need to listen to all your stakeholders, listen to your subject matter experts, but then have the bravery to stick to a tone, to a style, and to your user research, so that you're saying everything you need to say, but with fewer words. Oh, and this is a classic. So you've done your discovery, you've designed your product or your service, and a couple of weeks before release, you're like, oh, somebody should probably look at the content. And it's too late at that point to improve the flow of content, to juggle hierarchy around, to challenge where the content needs to be there. At that point, you're really just spell checking. There's not much else you can do. And rush content at the end of a project, it's rarely designed well. So readability may be lacking in terms of how you design that content, how you chunk it up, how you use your subheaders. Accessibility is often an afterthought. Have all your images got useful and clear tags for screen readers? Is it inclusive? So, for example, this is a rushed poster that came out before COVID. and got lambasted, quite rightly, for the imagery on it, because content isn't just words. You know, this imagery here was just reinforcing some very old stereotypes around the role of the man in the house and the role of the women. And quite rightly, this got pulled, but I think that imagery was somewhat rushed. The other thing here, which is really key, and I'm so pleased to be a part of within government, technical writing particularly is quite, it's realizing that some of the language we use, like blacklist and whitelist, is not appropriate. Black is not bad, white is not good. So in technical writing, there's in the UK government, and I believe a lot of the other technical organisations, we're moving from blacklist to blocklist, whitelist to allow list. We're also looking at labels like slave and master files. So I think that's a fantastic move forward. But also, if you rush content, you may not be as cognizant of those nuances. And of course, once you're live, I think it's really, really key with digital content, we can and we should improve the content that we've got there. But all too often this is done with no evidence or without interrogating the evidence that we have. I'm sure it's so tempting if a product owner comes to you and says, hey, I saw this tweet from one user at the weekend and they need this message, just to cheaply, because people say, well, it's a bit of content, it's always cheaper than doing the code or doing other things. And the temptation is just to actually, you know, almost carpet bomb your content with, you know, with this kind of feedback, responding immediately to this kind of feedback. But we have to check the analysis. We have to look at the numbers, check the Google Analytics, look how many people this is affecting, see if there's anything else we can do other than content. And then in that situation, possibly ask your user research team to dig deeper or pop that issue on a watch list. So how do you make sure your content is good? If your service has words or any other content, pictures, video, if it's just emojis in the future, get a content designer, and ideally an equal experts one. And really key, I think, here is make content part of your design team from the start. Ideally, if budget allows, bring a content designer on during discovery. This is when we get to listen to all those needs, business needs, user needs, government needs, and be part of the vision of where the service or product is going. Definitely get your content designer involved in the design phase, because we work very closely with interaction designers, looking at the flow of content, the hierarchy, the readability. So it's really kind of design pairing with a service designer or an interaction designer. Because actually a lot of our work happens in this phase. Content design happens before we even start writing the words and testing the words and iterating the words with users. And to close, this is a tweet from a friend and colleague. Content design is saying, you should have invited me to an earlier meeting until you die. Possibly not until you die, but certainly until you retire. So yeah, I just wondered what else you'd like to know about good content.
That's fantastic, Mia. Thank you very much. Really enjoyed that. We've got some questions, so I shall start with those. Great. The first question which I'd like to ask you is a great one. Do you have a different approach for dealing with content that's for kind of like citizens, for citizens, right, say, rather than sort of API documentation? Yeah,
absolutely. Although my mantra at the moment is developers as citizens too, which is, yeah, I think that the discipline of good content, a bit like Gio was saying earlier, it's about having the clarity of the message, the speed of people being able to use it and get from A to B. I think with API documentation, it's not just for developers. We've created some new documentation at HMRC at the moment, and our research showed that there are parts of that documentation that need to be read by product owners, delivery leads, business analysts that possibly don't have as rich a technical background. So there we've actually used very plain English, but then when it comes to descriptions and code snippets, of course, we can toggle the technical language, because there is also an argument that you need to speak to people in the language of their discipline. But there, what we always do in citizen-facing content, we tend to write for a reading age of 9. And I think with API documentation, write for the newest developer, the junior developer. That's probably key. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. Sort of related in a way, is a great question, but it may need further explanation. Is how do you cut copy but retain meaning and still get all your messaging out there? That sort of feels like, what is your job?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the key thing there is, have you validated with your research team, Erica, that every single message needs to be there? I think it's far easier on a functional journey than a product or a marketing piece, much more so. So really, it's being brave and challenging the need for that. Is it a business need or is it a true user need? And then the lovely thing with digital, of course, is you can layer content. So there may be some user groups that require help content. For example, so working on a UI at the moment for fraud and risk investigators at HMRC, and we're looking at help content that we can serve up as a second layer. So it's there for people who need it and not for people who don't. So possibly some of your messages don't need to go to everybody. But it is difficult because there will always be a kind of push me, pull you need from the business, from policy, from legal. And I think it's just around that there is an art to using fewer words and saying the same thing, definitely. And that's where plain English comes in, and you take away the colloquialisms, and that's fantastic for internationalization. And testing as well, test with users. Users will let you know if you're telling them too much or not enough.
Brilliant. Thank you. Two questions which I'm going to combine in one, actually, because they're very similar. So Jenny's asked, what's your preferred approach to terms and conditions to make them usable? Which is related to a question we had before the talk about, how can you create plain English when working with a legal blurb? I quote blurb.
Yeah. This is a fantastic question, actually, and it's something I love. I think a lot of people need to think, because it's legal language, it can't be plain English. The most important thing is court your legal department early. Get them, show them, the pain of impenetrable content. Show them users looking at clearer content and pair right with them. So instead of saying, hey, I'm going to take your legal language, I'm going to put my filter on it because I'm a content designer, and then I'm going to give you something that you may not be comfortable with. Do some pair writing. Don't be afraid. For example, I worked on the court orders for family courts for HM Courts and Tribunal Service. And there was 6 judges helping me with this content, helping a committee of judges helping with this content. But actually, by working with them, showing them the power of plain English, we managed to change some terminology in the courts that's been used for the last 20 years. For example, when you send documents to the court or to everybody else, it's called file and serve. We got rid of file and serve and said, send documents to the court and everybody else. And it's you've got to do it with care. You can't do this ripshod. You've got to take your stakeholders along with you. So it's not that kind of work with terms and conditions. It's not sitting in a quiet corner rewriting them for a week. It's really a journey.
Lovely, brilliant. Thanks very much, Mia. That's our talk's finished. Just a few quick summary things. I'd really appreciate your time spent doing this presentation, Erica, Liz, Mia, and Gio. Thank you so much. You make it look effortless, and we know even lightning talks take about as much effort as doing not lightning talks. So thank you so much for your time and effort on that. Our next talk in this series about brilliant women is tomorrow morning, in fact, UK time, 7 p.m. in Australia, when Neha Dutt will be talking about practical steps we can take to have a truly inclusive approach to delivery. And then next Tuesday, March 30th at 6 p.m. UK UTC, it will be Emma Robertson, who is the founder and CEO of Digital Awareness UK, is going to talk about employees and employers working together to improve tech habits. So just finally, again, thank you to everybody who's joined, all our audience. Thank you so much for being with us. You will find links to the recording for this call and all the Expert Talks Online on the Expert Talks Online tab of our website. So thank you once again, everybody.